The air in the operations room was thick with tension, as though every breath drawn might tip the scales of fate. Belousov sat at the head of the long table, his fingers drumming softly against the armrest, eyes fixed on the digital map glowing in front of him. The satellite feed flickered with ominous precision. Convoys of enemy armor were threading their way toward a critical choke point. Every red marker on the screen was a potential disaster, a calculated push that, if not stopped, could fracture the front lines within hours. The chatter among the officers was low and clipped. Intelligence analysts fed in updates, intercepted communications, ground reports, the movement patterns of enemy drones. The consensus was grim: whatever was coming would hit hard, and there was no margin for retreat. One officer suggested reinforcing with conventional artillery, another pressed for air strikes. Both proposals were met with curt shakes of the head. The time to prepare was gone. A major, standing by the projector, shifted uncomfortably before breaking the silence. "There is one other option," he began, his voice careful. "The Kinzhal." The room froze. Eyes darted toward Belousov. No one spoke at first, the name alone carried weight. Hypersonic, nearly unstoppable once launched, capable of striking with surgical precision at unimaginable speed, it was both a marvel of engineering and a weapon that could change the tone of the conflict in a heartbeat. Its deployment was not routine, it was a statement. Belousov leaned back, considering. He didn't need a lecture on its capabilities. He'd been part of the strategic briefings for years. What he needed to decide now was whether the situation warranted unleashing it. If it failed, it wouldn't just be a tactical loss. It would be a dent in the perception of strength. If it succeeded, the enemy wouldn't just retreat, they would rethink their entire campaign. "Show me the latest satellite feed again," he ordered. The screen refreshed, and the movement of the enemy units became almost hypnotic, like watching a swarm of ants converge on a single point. The timing was perfect. They were within the exact radius where one decisive strike could cripple command and control. He felt the weight of the decision pressing in from all sides. Around him, the faces of his staff betrayed a careful neutrality, though their eyes burned with expectation. No one wanted to be the one to say it out loud, but they all knew, this was the moment. Belousov exhaled slowly, then spoke in a voice that was calm but absolute. "Prepare for launch." The word snapped the room into motion. Orders rippled through the communications lines. Deep underground, in the missile command facility, technicians moved with almost mechanical precision. Heavy blast doors slid open, revealing the sleek, predatory shape of the missile resting on its launch platform. Fueling crews worked swiftly, loading propellants under strict safety protocols, their gloved hands steady despite the enormity of what they were doing. In the targeting center, operators uploaded the exact coordinates. Every calculation was double-checked, then triple-checked. The Kinzhal was not a weapon to be used casually. There was no undo button once the ignition sequence began. A quiet hum of electronics filled the air as systems came online, green lights blooming one after another on the consoles. Back in the command room, Belousov received confirmation: all systems were nominal. The missile was ready. On the wall-mounted screens, tactical overlays danced with data: weather conditions, enemy movement speed, possible countermeasures. The clock was ticking. Each passing minute brought the enemy closer to their objective, but also ensured that when the strike came, it would land at the most devastating possible moment. Belousov's gaze didn't waver from the screen. In war, timing was as much a weapon as steel or fire. And this strike, when it came, would be remembered. Banks of monitors cast a cold glow across the room as the surveillance teams locked in on the enemy. Lines of armored vehicles crept across the terrain like a dark tide, their movement patterns dissected in real time by analysts. Reconnaissance drones, hovering high above the combat zone, streamed live feeds back to headquarters. Every detail down to the positioning of a command jeep or the angle of a radar dish was logged, marked, and filed. Technicians worked in perfect sync, their focus absolute. Satellite imaging specialists zoomed in and out of key points, looking for confirmation of high-value targets. A radar operator raised his voice briefly over the quiet hum of machinery. Target grouping confirmed. They're in the kill zone. The statement was clinical, but the implication was lethal. Belousov stood behind the main console, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes followed the enemy movements without blinking, as though he could will them to make a mistake. The Kinzhal was primed, the coordinates locked, yet he waited for the optimal window. Once fired, the missile would reach its target in minutes. There would be no second chance to correct a miscalculation. Outside, far from the command room, a ground crew prepared the launcher. The weapon gleamed under floodlights, its aerodynamic lines a sharp contrast to the rough metal scaffolding surrounding it. Engineers ran diagnostics, their voices muffled through headsets as they confirmed each system in turn: propulsion, guidance, warhead integrity. Every confirmation was reported up the chain until it reached the command center. "Systems ready," came the final transmission. Belousov nodded once, a silent signal for the operations officer to proceed. A coded sequence flashed across the screen, authorizing the missile control team to take over. In the missile chamber, a launch key turned, initiating the ignition protocol. The fueling pumps shut down, clamps holding the missile in place hissed and retracted. The room seemed to grow quieter, as though the air itself was bracing for what was about to happen. "Launch in 3, 2, 1. The roar of the missile engines burst through the speakers, the sound feeding back from remote microphones at the launch site. On screen, the Kinzhal leapt upward with almost unreal acceleration, its tail flame burning white against the dark sky. In seconds, it was a streak of light racing toward the stratosphere. Inside the command center, the telemetry displays lit up with data, velocity climbing past Mach 5, then Mach 7, Mach 10. Operators tracked its trajectory with disciplined detachment, their hands moving across controls and readouts without hesitation. No one dared take their eyes off the screens. At the forward observation posts, soldiers on the ground tilted their heads to the soundless streak slicing the upper atmosphere. It was a ghost to the naked eye, too fast, too high, too fleeting to truly comprehend. Enemy radar finally caught a blip, but by then it was too late. Warning systems screamed inside their mobile command vehicles, operators shouting coordinates and evasive orders into radios. The missile was already diving, its precision guidance system locked onto the lead formation. Belousov's screen showed the final seconds in stark clarity. A targeting reticle fixed on the cluster of command units. The impact came with a blinding flash, followed by a violent shockwave that sent debris and dust surging skyward. The communications feed from enemy channels fractured into chaos, urgent commands, panicked cries, then silence. The first strike had landed. The rest of the battle was about to change forever. The blast zone was still boiling with dust and smoke when the first post-strike imagery began streaming in. Reconnaissance drones circled high above, their cameras cutting through the haze with infrared vision. Where once there had been a tightly coordinated armored spearhead, now there was only wreckage, charred hulls of tanks and armored carriers scattered across blackened earth. The enemy's command vehicles were nothing more than twisted fragments, their frames still glowing from the heat of impact. The Kinzhal had struck like a fist from nowhere, and the effect was immediate. Enemy communications had been gutted in a single stroke, the central node that directed their movements was gone. Surveillance picked up the first signs of panic, a group of infantry abandoning their positions, scattering into the fields, some discarding weapons as they ran. Others froze in place, caught in a paralysis of disbelief at the destruction around them. Belousov stood over the tactical display, watching the patterns unravel. In minutes, their formation had gone from tight, aggressive lines to a disjointed scatter of isolated units. Officers in the command room exchanged brief, knowing glances. There was no recovering from a loss of coordination this complete. On the ground, the chaos spread like fire. Tank crews sat motionless inside their steel shells, engines idling, unsure whether to advance, retreat, or hold. Without central orders, the chain of command disintegrated. Radios crackled with overlapping voices, platoon leaders demanding instructions, junior officers reporting losses, all of it dissolving into confused noise. A drone operator zoomed in on one enemy artillery position. The soldiers there were trying to manually align their guns, working from hastily drawn maps, but their aim was erratic and slow. Without guidance, their fire would be blind and ineffective. Another camera feed showed a convoy of supply trucks stalled in the road, their drivers milling around aimlessly, some even turning their vehicles around in retreat. Belousov's chief of staff leaned toward him. "Sir, they're finished. Permission to advance." Belousov gave a single nod. The order was relayed instantly to forward units. In the forests and fields along the contested zone, Russian mechanized infantry began to move. Engines rumbled, treads churned mud, and columns of armored vehicles pushed toward the disorganized enemy lines. There was no rush, the advance was steady, deliberate, almost surgical. As the forward battalions crossed into the strike zone, the full extent of the damage became clear. The ground was littered with shattered equipment, radar dishes bent like paper, launchers tipped on their sides, ammunition crates scattered and burning. The acrid scent of fuel and scorched metal clung to the air. Here and there, enemy soldiers knelt beside their ruined vehicles, some waving white cloths, others simply too dazed to react. What resistance did appear was sporadic and disjointed. Isolated squads opened fire without coordination, their bursts of gunfire quickly silenced by concentrated return fire. Tanks that attempted to reposition were picked off before they could form defensive lines. Within an hour, the area that had once been an enemy stronghold was reduced to isolated pockets of men, cut off from one another and without hope of reinforcement. From the command center, Belousov watched the map shift in real time. Red markers representing enemy assets faded one by one, replaced by blue icons as positions were secured. There was no cheering, no outward celebration, only the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. The Kinzhal had not just destroyed the enemy's spearhead. It had shattered their will to fight. And now, with their lines broken and their commands silenced, the battlefield belonged entirely to him. The sun was dipping low on the horizon when the first armored units rolled into what was left of the enemy's central sector. The road was littered with the wreckage of vehicles that only hours earlier had been part of a confident, advancing force. Smoke curled from craters where shells and fuel trucks had detonated, and the occasional crackle of small fires whispered in the still air. The silence was almost unnatural for a battlefield. There were no coordinated barrages, no steady rhythm of returning fire. Only scattered sounds of boots on debris and the faint rumble of approaching reinforcements. Forward squads moved with practiced caution, clearing buildings and tree lines, though resistance was minimal. The few defenders who remained were disorganized and running low on ammunition. In several cases, Russian soldiers found them huddled in trenches or half-buried dugouts, their rifles cast aside. Captives were swiftly disarmed and escorted to secured zones. Those who resisted were met with decisive force, though most seemed to understand the futility of further fighting. Belousov's armored spearhead pushed deeper, seizing key intersections and crossroads. Engineers began inspecting bridges and supply routes, ensuring the passage of heavier support vehicles and artillery. Behind the front, logistics teams moved up quickly, ready to establish temporary depots for ammunition and fuel. It was the kind of organized occupation that ensured the enemy would have no opportunity to regroup. Among the wreckage, soldiers discovered the remnants of the enemy's field headquarters. Charred fragments of maps, shattered radios, and twisted metal frames marked where the command trailers had stood. A few intact storage containers yielded valuable intelligence, encrypted documents, lists of call signs, and field orders that might help decode their wider operational plans. Everything was carefully catalogued and sent back to intelligence officers for immediate analysis. By dusk, the zone was firmly under Russian control. The last isolated gunfire had faded, and the only movement among the enemy was that of surrendering groups emerging from hiding. The front-line troops knew the battle was won here, but the victory was more than just territory gained. It was psychological dominance cemented by the strike that had started it all. In the capital, the news arrived before the smoke had even settled. Military briefings described the success in measured terms, but the underlying message was unmistakable: the Kinzhal had proven its worth. It wasn't just a missile, it was a statement of technological and strategic superiority. Belousov appeared on national television that evening, standing at a podium with the flag behind him. His expression was calm, his tone steady, but every word carried weight. He spoke of precision, discipline, and the commitment to defending the nation's security. He framed the operation not as an act of escalation, but as a demonstration of readiness and capability. The subtext was clear to anyone listening beyond the borders: those who underestimated this weapon, or the resolve behind it, did so at their own peril. Internationally, the reaction was immediate. Military analysts on foreign news networks replayed grainy satellite footage of the missile's flight path, speculating on its speed and maneuverability. Governments issued statements, some condemning the strike, others quietly noting its effectiveness. Behind closed doors, defense ministries recalculated the implications of facing such a weapon in future conflicts. Belousov did not address the speculation. He knew the images of the aftermath, the precise timing of the launch, and the sheer swiftness of the enemy's collapse spoke louder than any press release could. As night fell over the newly secured sector, patrols fanned out to maintain order. Engineers worked under floodlights to repair damaged roads, and medical units tended to both wounded allies and captured foes. The battlefield, once bristling with tension and danger, was now firmly under control. The operation had begun with a single decision in a silent command room. It ended with a message that would echo far beyond the borders of the conflict: the era of hypersonic warfare had truly arrived, and it bore the name Kinzhal.